Hi everyone and welcome to Pro Tools Answers, where three Pro Tools experts discuss, demonstrate and elaborate on your Pro Tools questions put to the community in Avid's official Facebook support forum. And as Andy and myself, Dave, take you deep into the workings of Pro Tools technique and ethos to help the user community understand and get the best out of their investment. And we hope that our tutorials and discussions are helping you do just that. In last week's episode, we discussed the silly Andy. It was a silly myth that users shouldn't touch the master fader, and in this episode we're going to discuss a scenario in which we use them, which should helpfully convince you to use them in every session and why to touch them when you need to.
There you go.
Yeah. So shall we just dive straight into it? Okay, so I have a session here where my entire mix is being run through this auxiliary track here. So everything is being run through, well, I'm actually running everything through a Brower bus, and so we can see all of my tracks are being grouped or sent rather to subgroups in my Brower matrix, and then the tracks in my Brower matrix are being sent out through a mix path, and they're arriving at this 2-bus auxiliary / folder track right here. And we can see that's true because if I hit play and I adjust the 2-bus fader, everything should disappear in your mix as well as in your ears as well as mine.
Great sounding drums, Dave.
Do you think so? I can't hear them actually. I haven't got the routing turned on to my head.
No, it's good.
Okay. Yeah. So we can see that everything disappeared for you guys, right? So that shows us that everything is running through here. Now, something that I see relatively often with newer engineers, newer students, is that they absolutely love to cook their master bus. And what I'm talking about is, can we just cover our ears for a second? Actually, let me turn that down and push that all the way up there. This is the kind of thing that we see relatively regularly with new people, right? Is that their master bus is being, the signal is just busting out of the top of that meter bridge. And that's simply because they've got too much signal going into the final stage of their mix because all of their tracks are just too loud. So what we tend to do during sessions, and I hope you guys are the same as me, because I'm certainly telling my students to do all this, when they're mixing their tracks, keep an eye on the 2-bus just to see what the levels are doing. And I think typically if we're mixing, we're setting a hard ceiling of around about -6 dB, I think, before we send on to the next mastering stage. Is that similar for you guys?
6 to 12 is what I usually send out.
Somewhere between -6 and -12. Okay, so it's between there, but it's not between 6 and 0 or 6 and plus 10, is it?
Right.
Right. But again, what can happen is that as you add more tracks in, and as you're boosting stuff and you're making stuff thicker and fatter, more signal is creeping into the master bus. And if you end up forgetting, what can potentially happen is that you'll end up in this scenario where you've got epic amounts of signal going into your master fader, not master fader. And what the hell can you do about that? Because we can't just turn it down in the output fader here, because this is controlling the output going to speakers / container. We want to be able to control the signal going into this 2-bus. Hopefully everyone can still hear me okay. And so we want to control the signal going in here, and also going through any 2-bus processing that we might have happening on that particular on that 2-bus fader. Now, a lot of people may be thinking, well, why don't you just turn all of the tracks down? Which is an option. You know, I could engage the all group and then turn everything down, but the problem is, because I've got so much subgrouping going on in here, snares, and I've got a couple of basses right here that are subgrouped. I've got BVs that are subgrouped. That's going to be engaging every fader and bringing every fader down, not just the subgroup. So it's going to be changing the gain stage across all of my mix.
You know what else it's going to do? is going to change your wet mix, because I'm looking up into your sends, and there's a couple of pre-fader sends in there.
There are.
So bringing down your fader will bring up the level of reverb or whatever that send's going to in relation. So it's a dangerous, dangerous game to play.
Yes. So the all group is out of commission in that scenario. And another way that we could potentially do this is we could select all of the tracks that are going to our 2-bus, and then we can group those, and we can use a group to bring those down, right, all together. But there is a very specific complexity that would potentially prevent that from happening. What might that be? Class?
Well, maybe you already have competing groups, of course, but I mean, you could use a VCA as well.
Yeah, VCAs were brought up, but why would we use the VCA? It's because there is automation programmed into the tracks. The moment that you program that automation in, suddenly you don't really have control over those tracks unless you do what Anders said and bring in VCA. But it's a slightly clunky way of doing it, I think. When we have the master fader available to us, and one of the differences between the master fader and the VCA track is if we plug the VCA track into the group for the purposes of controlling that entire group, the VCA is metering just the loudest track in the group, right?
That's right.
Whereas the master fader is metering the culmination of the signals in that bus.
Both are tremendously useful, by the way, in different circumstances. But yes, you're 100% right, 0% wrong.
So in this particular circumstance, I want to be metering what my bus is doing. I don't want to be metering. So hence why I wouldn't necessarily reach for a VCA. And that's also assuming, by the way, that I'm not running through something like a Brouwer matrix where everything is running to these 4 or 5 subgroups, if you include all the vocal stuff, where we could potentially say that we could group the output faders for the Brouwer matrix and then bring those down. But that's not typically the way that this technique works anyway. There is a much better way to do it, I feel. So what I have here on my 2-bus is a mix trim that is monitoring the mix path that is going into my 2-bus. And that is specifically there to control the level that arrives at that subgroup.
Just to be clear here, this is a master fader track. You can see this because of the track type icon, which is the Sigma. Whereas one of my students said, no, it's the M for master. You just have to tilt your head.
Magic. Which is absolutely right, Anders. Yes, did you give them extra credit? Or did you send them to the corner and tell them to think about what they do?
That's why all those Greek mathematicians just walked around all day like this.
Yeah.
So we were doing a little bit of this beforehand when we were talking about the level. We were controlling the amount of level going into the 2-bus using this specific master fader here. And by assigning the master fader to the mix path, we're giving it overall control of that bus, the signal for that bus, before it arrives at its destination. So the way that I like to think of master faders, I kind of think they're a little bit mislabeled. I like the term bus trim. How would that sit with you guys? Could we petition for a name change?
Nope.
I didn't think so. I'm preaching to a choir in the wrong church. But by putting a master fader here and by assigning the mix path to the master fader to the mix path, I'm essentially sticking a trim control right at the point at which the signal arrives at this 2-bus here. So I can control the amount of signal going into the 2-bus and all of its associated plugins, remember. So if I'm finding that I've got too much signal going into this bus, but actually it's quite nice right there. If I find this, I can then just bring the entire signal path down and have it peaking exactly where I want it to without having to do any extra work. Things like VCAs, things like grouping, bringing tracks down manually. I've got one fader that allows me to control the entire signal heading into the 2-bus. And for my money, that's a fantastic amount of control.
I love it. I like the way you have it set up because you have the mix trim master fader, which controls the level going to your mix routing folder, which is kind of that's where you control how your mix sounds. Mm-hmm. But then you also have a master out master fader, which is what I talked about last week when we talked about don't touch the master fader. So you're going, you've got that control at the end, but you also added another layer of control prior to the end, which is awesome. And Dave, though, don't you know? I'm sorry, I thought you knew. You're not supposed to touch the master fader.
But Andy.
But Andy, he trashed
You are.
his preferences first.
Oh, he trashed his preferences. Okay, you trashed your preferences.
You know what? I was pushing the signal in, touching the master fader as I shouldn't have done, pushing the signal to go in. But if let's say my signal is going into,
let's just hope that everyone's actually watched the entire episode last week.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
It's of course fine to touch the master fader.
Yeah, definitely.
It is completely fine.
And here's a scenario where we're doing so. So the master fader is at 0, controlling the signal going into the 2 bus, and it's just peaking at 0. Right? I don't want that. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to use that master fader to bring that signal down, arriving to my 2 bus. Such a great way to do it. And then, as Andy pointed out, I also have a master fader that controls the amount of signal coming out of my 2 bus before it hits the speakers or it hits tape. So if I've got some processing going on, compression, EQ, stereo widening, limiting, tape saturation, going on my 2 bus for the purposes of 2 bus processing, there could potentially be a level increase that you might have programmed in there. And what this master fader is doing is monitoring how much signal is heading to tape / heading to speakers. So if I'm in this kind of scenario where I've just pumped a little bit too much level in with my 2 bus processing and it's just peaking the level a little bit, I can use the master fader to control the level and just bring that level down before hitting tape or hitting my speakers.
With zero sonic price to pay. Right?
Exactly.
It's going to be completely both the master fader prior to your mix track and after the mix track, both of those can be completely touched to take advantage of that, which removes the need really to go through all the other stuff that we talked about of moving, creating an all group or creating a group of all your stems and stuff like that. Yeah. Dave, one thing I'm noticing here, and this is a little bit off the beaten path, but it's something that I think is useful for listeners to take a look at, is you've got different meters going on. So if you take a look at your master fader, your metering is different, is it not?
Yes.
Yes. So you're looking on your master faders. You've got a different metering than you have on your other faders. Am I reading that right? Or am I wrong?
Yeah, you are. I'm using the extended meters for the master fader and the linear ones for everything else.
Right. So, and by the way, that's part of the reason why the meters didn't look the same in on the MX trim track and the mix track. Otherwise, it would, because those are basically 2 meters of exactly the same thing.
Yes.
So you can change your metering for master faders versus other tracks or not, and sometimes it's great. Sometimes it causes confusion. So what Dave has done here is you right-click on the meter of, let's say, master fader track, and he's got linear extended. Great, nothing wrong with that. Perfect. If you wanted then to change it to something else, let's go with linear extended for master faders, but for all other tracks, let's just do sample peak, just because it's a clearly different thing.
Okay, so linear extended for master faders and sample peak for everything else.
Right, and you can see now that your meters now look a little bit different, and that your scale is going to be different. That's fine, but it can be confusing. The other place you can do this, and where you have a little bit extra control, is in your Pro Tools preferences. And if you go into metering, up in the upper left-hand corner, track and meter types, you can do the same thing that you just did, or you can do this. There's a checkbox here, track and master meter types which means all tracks plus master fader tracks, meters types are linked. I've met people who like it both ways, by the way. And when I first started messing around with meters, I liked checking that box because having two different meters going on in my session just did my brain in for about a year and a half. So it's two different kinds of things. But again, this is another advantage of knowing what master faders are and the job that they do. If you know that and you understand it, then you can have actually two different meters that you could take a look at, which gives you two different kinds of information for two different kinds of jobs, right?
There's something else about metering as well, that if you go to the preferences, it's probably the only thing in preferences that you can go straight to the tab. You don't end up going, well, I think it's there. Oh, no, it's not there. It's there. There's a metering tab.
Yep.
We know exactly where to go. I want to close out with one other thing, and something specific about master faders that some people may not know, and this is an important thing for processing, and why we don't tend to use them as the last point in the signal chain is because the inserts appear after the fader. The only track in Pro Tools that are post fader, correct?
That's correct.
I'm right. Okay, so hence why we wouldn't use them for compression, mainly for dynamic control, really, because if I stick an LA2A on here, and let's just
Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it.
we can see signal going into the system, but watch what happens when I drop the master fader. All of the signal disappears out of that compressor. So if you've programmed in some specific gain stages throughout your 2-bus processing, if you were to use the master fader for 2-bus processing, and then you program in a fade out, or you're doing some automation to ride the output level, you're going to be changing the amount of gain or level going into your 2-bus processing, which is essentially going to change a little bit the character of your mix. And we don't want to do that. We just want to use this output fader here to control the overall level. We don't want to change the mix, unless you do.
Well, so you use the term processing, and I just wanted to specify it a little bit. We use different processing on different tracks, right? So I agree with you, though. How many times have we heard the fade out of a song and you can hear the compressor kick out, right? Because somebody did a fade out on a master fader and there's a compressor on the track because they're using the master fader wrong. Happens all the time, unfortunately. Which is why you would put that compressor on what you've got here, your routing folder track or an aux track or whatever. Specifically because all of your inserts are pre-fader, so that whatever you change with your fader isn't going to change the level hitting the track. And so for most people, for a lot of people, for myself certainly, the tonal shaping aspects all stay on that mix track, on the track that has the inserts prior to the fader. However, that's not to say that there isn't processing on the master fader track. There is, and it's important processing. Limiter. You put your limiter on there because you want your limiter to only be kind of like your last stage, unless you're really crunching your limiter, and that's a different kettle of fish. But you've got your limiter, which keeps you from going over. Your metering, if you've got metering plugins, you definitely want those post fader, and dither.
Yeah, indeed. So what I tend to use my master fader for, I'm slightly different to you, Andy. I tend to put a limiter right at the end of the signal chain on my 2-bus. And then just use the master fader for metering and control. And I'm using the meters to check that the signal isn't exceeding that which I want it to exceed. So on my master fader, I just have an RTA that's monitoring the sonic makeup of the track. I might use a vector scope to check the stereo imaging. And I'll be using something like DP meter to check the LUFS level. But we also have Pro Limiter, which does a great job of showing us our LUFS as well. And some metering.
And a very transparent limiter. I'll tell you what, man. Free plugin. Use it, because
I'm using it on every track.
I have abused that plugin far more than I ever thought I could. I'm like, it can't possibly work, and it does.
And that's why I'm happy to use it on this Master Fader, because it's transparent.
Yeah.
Same with all of this
That's right.
stuff. They're transparent processes. And then dither on the end if I want to apply any dithering. But
That's right.
this Master Fader here, the inserts are just being used for metering. They're being used for informational purposes, and the Master Fader is being used for level control.
Great stuff.
Yeah, great, wonderful.
Tear me apart now. Come on, come at me. Come at me. What did I do wrong?
No, I think that's everything you said is true. The only thing that I would just like explain to the viewers is your use of words. Speaking about the tubas and the master, you sometimes say as the same word, but you're referring to that aux track, or in this case the routing folder track, right?
Yes, it's just an aux track that's been converted to a routing folder, so that, and let me just reshare again so I can show you how I'm doing this. It's been converted to a routing folder so that I can just fold down my master section, basically, which has got headphone monitoring, and there's a print track in there as well somewhere. So it's just a track preset that's got all of the routing for my headphones, which come through a different bus, so I can use VSX, and it's got my master faders in there, print track in there, etc. So is there anything that we can add to this conversation for today?
Brilliant, I say.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Manish.
Don't encourage him, Anders. Right, so we'll leave that there then. If you enjoyed what we were doing today, hit like on our video. Please subscribe to our channel as well, so you can follow us and all of the videos that we release each week, just showing you how Pro Tools works, hopefully how to use it properly. That's why the three of us are here, so that we can just check that each other are doing it correctly. And hit the bell icon so you get notified when our new stuff gets released. You can head over to protoolsanswers.com. You can subscribe over there. Well, Andy will write to you every week and let you know what we're doing. And then if you fancy taking that next step and supporting Pro Tools Answers, you can join our own inner circle, which has some lovely benefits that you can read about on protoolsanswers.com. And all it leaves me to say is we will see you guys in the next episode. Thank you very much to Anders.
Thank you.
And to Andy.
You betcha.
My name's Dave. This is Pro Tools Answers, and we're out.